So marketplace revenue, we did that first slide. There was a bunch of stuff, GMV, AOV, take rate, net revenue, gross profit, contribution margin, the list goes on. Okay. That's really a funnel, right? But it's kind of, it's kind of funky relative to everything else, right? Like what business is telling you like, hey, look at this big headline number, but in reality, we only make this, right? It's kind of a weird way to think about it. But why GMV is important is that marketplaces are about transaction volume, right? That is what their core job is to facilitate transaction. And so the GMV is essentially a way to measure relative sizes of marketplaces because the revenue can actually be very different across marketplaces based on the take rate. And the take rate is really a function of many things, what the market's willing to pay, but also the nature of your marketplace. If you have a very disparate kind of marketplace where the supply is very heterogeneous, so very different, you can actually charge more because bringing together transactions is much harder, right? And so therefore, if you're facilitating hard transactions and doing more things for the marketplace, you can charge more, right? In marketplaces where there's like high liquidity already and standardization, you cannot charge as much because people don't need you as much, right? They will take the demand, but they will not be willing to pay a lot for it because they can source it themselves. And so GMV is like the great equalizer in terms of like comparison, right? Revenue, great to compare, but not necessarily apples to apples, dependent on take rate structure. And so GMV, whole pie, we're getting into the holidays. We're just past Thanksgiving. It's like the whole pumpkin pie. Your net revenue is that slice that, mom gives you. And I gave a few examples of what like take rates might look like. They're all over the place, honestly. Some marketplaces have 10, some have 3, some have 1, some have up to 50, right? It really depends on the type of marketplace you are. But for most part, marketplaces tend to take on both sides because it's the sharing economy after all. And we all share the transaction. All right. So I could put this together to kind of visualize what is marketplace revenue, right? Like how does this look? And so that GMV, that's the big pie, right? And really that kind of leg down into net revenue is that take rate, right? And that is that platform fee that is charged by the marketplace. And that's less cancellations, chargebacks, and discounts, right? Like this is not, you can't include this as much as you might like to get that number bigger. Those things need to be taken out. Net revenue, going down to gross profit, this is a very, standard finance metric, right? Is net revenue less the cost of goods sold. And the cost of goods sold or the cost of expenses directly related to the transaction, right? So I think your server costs, things like that. Now, one of the crazy parts is that gross profit in marketplaces can be really high because it doesn't actually take that much for you to make a transaction happen, right? Like you don't have heavy hardware costs or things like that. This is an online business. It's great. It's got the cloud. We love it. It's low marginal cost, right, per transaction. Where the rubber meets the road though is gross profit to contribution margin in marketplaces. There are many marketplaces that look great on paper, the gross profit, and then you hit the contribution margin and you're like, ooh, like that is not good. And the reason is that contribution margin is less all the variable expenses to make a transaction occur. And this is like, if you want to look in the mirror for your business and know where you stand, I highly recommend looking at contribution margin. And it's because it takes into all the things like trust and safety, like what marketing costs do you have? The list goes on. What analytics needs do you have? Really anything related, there's a variable expense related to, making a transaction occur that aren't fixed costs in the business. Think rent, computer purchases, things like that, right? And there's 2 levels of contribution margin. There's contribution margin 1, which is kind of less all variable expenses, but not marketing. Then contribution margin 2 is really, kind of full contribution margin would be less your marketing expenses. And that less marketing expenses is really like if you're just reporting your contribution margin, like your residual dollars left to cover your fixed costs. We did the revenue here. This is great. We figured out gross profit and contribution margin, right? So now we know on a per transaction basis, how much do we make, right? this contribution margin, like typically is going to be somewhere from 0% of the transaction, hopefully not negative. It can be negative, and in certain cases it will, up to, maybe 50%. Like, there's not many businesses that have contribution margins that are like way above 50% or things like that. If you got it, awesome, but I guarantee you're probably not at scale. So the contribution margin gives us those residual dollars, right? And that is what, at a per user level, we want to understand is like, for every user, right? Let's say on the demand side, in Outdoorsy's case, this would be a renter. Like, how many contribution margin dollars does a renter produce for us over their lifetime? Similarly, you may also ask on the supply side, how much contribution margin dollars is created by bringing one unit of supply onto the platform, right, over their lifetime. And those are two really important metrics to understand because they allow you to back out and say, how much should we acquire a customer for, right? And there are some very, basic benchmarks, and we're going to go into this in more detail around 3-to-1 and 5-to-1. Those are kind of like prototypical conventional wisdom. I don't personally love conventional wisdom, but those are kind of like mental benchmarks that you should be aware of that, investors, other operators, people external to your company use as kind of a rubric, like for just, quick math, like where do you stack up? And that 3-to-1 ratio is at 3 years and 5-to-1 is at 5 years. Now, why is that potentially wrong, right? Like, I think a lot of that kind of framework came from looking at early software businesses and hardware businesses and understanding what those LTV to CACs look like over certain periods of time. Many SaaS businesses have a long payback period, right? Because let's say you're selling payroll software, you got to go in, convince the company, do this like migration, there's just a lot of cost associated with it. And then it takes years to make your money back. Marketplaces don't necessarily work like that, right? Because they can have higher frequency, you can make money right up front. And so those same metrics I don't think are as like applicable. And so they are a benchmark, but I would say don't view them as the holy grail either, right? Your business is your business and you need to talk about it in the way that it works. And I think I shared kind of a rubric and about how to like look at your marketplace. And one of the things I like always give people advice on is like, tell people what your business is not, right? Like your metrics are your metrics and they are not somebody else's metrics and their metrics are not you, right? And it's really critically important to like be upfront and tell people why your metrics are the way they are, because that's your business and not try to be a different business. Like if you try to be another business, like maybe it works, but for the most part, I think people will fail. So anyway, for example, for Outdoorsy, again, low like demand side frequency, right? The sooner like we told people that we were low frequency on the demand side, the better off we were getting away from being compared to Uber's, Uber and scooter companies, right? Like there wasn't a good comparison. They're not apples to apples, right? They're very different things. So just telling that people that like, I've experienced this too. It's not like a unique problem to you. You really have to tell your story up front.